understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Dillon. I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
I'm Sam. I study language and culture.
And today we will let you know what we're talking about. But before we do that, we are going to talk about what are we paying attention to. And so, Samantha, what have you been paying attention to lately?
Early in the morning, so I'm drinking iced coffee. I've been paying attention to, for Christmas, Dillon loves two things. He loves food and he loves theology. So I got him this book, it's too early, written by a Lutheran pastor. Is it just called Food Theology? Food Theology?
No, Food Theology.
Food Theology. There's a section of his book that I got him that references a book that he recommended to me that I have been reading on my Kindle, and I'm almost done with it. I don't know if you can see on my Kindle here. It's called Take This Bread by Sarah Miles. It's so good. It's really good.
It's also a great cover.
Yeah, it is a great cover. It is all about the Eucharist, communion, but specifically how fleshy and embodied the Christian story is, and how, so she was raised in an atheist family, like actively against Christianity, like they were harmed by it and yada yada. And then as an adult, she was also a journalist, and she went into high conflict areas in Central America, and she was like in war, right? And she also worked in the restaurant world, so she talks a lot about that and how she was in these poor areas and strangers who barely had enough to feed themselves would feed her. Even people who hated her would feed her sometimes, and how she always had this like through line of food and being fed by friends, by strangers, and even by enemies sometimes, and how it would sustain her. And then she walked into a church when she was an adult later in life, and she participated in communion for the first time ever, and it was just wild for her. It was beyond rationality. She just started to believe. And I like the way she talks about conversion. She says, I'm still being converted. Like, it's not like a conversion moment for her. It's just this ongoing thing. And then she started, so the church she walked into was St. Gregory's in San Francisco. It's an Episcopal church. And then she started a food pantry there. Not even a food pantry, like a food program. She doesn't even like to call it a program. It was just an extension of Eucharist.
It was an extension of the table.
Yeah, they would put groceries and like figure out where to get food, but like fresh food. Because the idea is it can be kind of disempowering to hand people food. Here you go. When like they're people, how about have them shop? So they would just get like 50 pounds of potatoes or whatever they had that week. And she goes through the logistics. But she also doesn't romanticize what it's like to do that kind of social work. I mean, there's a line in there where she says, I effing hate the Russians. Like, she's just flat out, because there's Russians in her line waiting to get food and they're screaming at her. And she talks about what that's like. There's addicts, there's schizophrenics in that line. There's people who clearly haven't showered in a long time, just like marginalized people who would have been at Jesus's table, by the way. And she's talking about how she loves them, but she's not romanticizing it. She's also talking about how some of them are very difficult. And the program, again, she doesn't like to call it a program, but this program grew so big that it became very difficult for them. And she had to maneuver all of that because she didn't want to have to check IDs because there's immigrants. She didn't want to have to say, you have to be in this zip code, because Jesus didn't say feed everybody in your zip code. He said feed everybody, right? Which, by the way, I'm not against having those parameters, but this is just her talking, and it's kind of beautiful, and it all somehow works out. But again, not in this romantic, like everything was great. She's so practical about it, but it's about her conversion experience and how food has been a through line for all of it. And it connects it back to the Eucharist, communion, over and over again. And it's one of the best books I think I've read in the past 5 years. It's very good. What are you paying attention to, Dylan?
Well, let me just make a quick comment. So the book that Samantha's reading, which is pretty cool. Could you put it up just one more time? The
I just
cover. So it's a
wait.
peanut.
So they don't see both of us at the same time. They only see me if I'm talking. All right, you see it? Go ahead.
So it's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it's cut in quarters like a cross. Pretty cool. No, I'm just thinking back to one of my professors for my sacraments class, and said that if we can't just feed people spiritually with stories, but we have to feed them physically with food. And it's interesting because he also agrees with this author, in that he says, and it starts with the Eucharist. It starts with communion by sharing the bread and wine. So that just made me think about
And,
that.
and not in a sneaky way, like I'm going to feed you if you come to my church. They
Oh
didn't
no,
anybody
no,
stay at church. It's
no.
just they actually thought of this as church. They're like, this is church. We're feeding them. And some
So
people would ask her to pray with them, and she felt weird about that, but then she started doing it. And she was almost seen as like this. Anyway, you got to read it. I could go on and on about the book, but go ahead. What are
yeah,
you
so here's an interesting thing actually about that, and that I'll share
saying?
mine very quickly. Mine's not as profound as Samantha's what's going on in my life, but um, it's interesting because from time to time, even our church that we attended, and I'm the pastor at, we get new people all the time, and not in droves, but trickled through here and there. Just on Sunday, um, there was someone who dropped in, and it was interesting. They came in, and they had a little trouble navigating in the beginning, and then they sat with someone, but then they came up for communion. And here's the thing: I don't know if that person was baptized. I don't know if that person was that this was the first time they were having communion. I didn't really know, but my job is not to ask those questions at the time of the Eucharist, but to extend Christ's table through bread and wine, to be able to include that person, regardless of where they are in their sacrament life passages.
I mean, the
Um,
people at the Last Supper, they weren't all baptized, were they?
they were not.
Right. So,
They were not.
I mean,
Well,
if our
we assume they were not, but there is a long standing, and I get it. There's a long standing early Christian understanding that before you would receive the Eucharist, you would be baptized into that is what welcomes you. And I get the whole logistics of it, and I'm not even opposed to it. But my
I'm
thing
not
is,
opposed to it either, but I think being legalistic about it, if somebody comes
yeah,
up, you feed them
yeah,
because um, if all of the rituals of the church are supposed to embody the story of Jesus, right? That's what we're doing in church is we're just
yeah,
constantly trying to live out the story in an embodied and fleshed way. Well, people at the Last Supper weren't necessarily that we know of baptized. So,
right,
okay.
yeah.
What are you
So
paying
so
attention to, Dylan?
that just made me. So this week I fell down the steps, and I broke two toes, and like the outer ridge, I've either bruised it or broke it, of my foot, and it's feeling a little better. It's been almost 3 days now, and I haven't done much with it except elevate it and try to rest it, but. I've realized how fragile the body is, and I'm 34. I thought that maybe it would be a long time till I fell down the steps. I was chasing our girls. We were playing, and I was saying, "I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. I'm the monster." And I fell down 4 steps and just like split my foot in half. And it wasn't fun. But I'm thinking about how fragile the body is. Just one little like thing can really kind of throw you off for a couple days or a week or two. And so I'm feeling that right now, and I'm thinking about the fragility of of the human body, and which also makes me think about how we, and I know this is getting mushy gushy, but how we care for each other. And so I've been thinking about that. That's what I've been thinking.
It is related to what I've been paying attention to because I've been thinking about the Eucharist a lot and how it's so embodied. And you're talking about the body.
Yeah.
And it is when I was pregnant, that was the first time I had ever I've never broken a bone. I've never needed stitches. I've never had any real physical suffering, thank goodness. But then I was pregnant and I was very, very, very sick and hospitalized and yada yada through both of my pregnancies. And I remembered thinking, I always thought that I was a somewhat tough person.
Right.
And I thought that if I had to endure some kind of suffering or diagnosis or ailment, that I could do it with some dignity. And as
Yeah.
I can attest, I did not. I,
Well,
it was physical suffering is a thing. It's a real thing
yeah.
that can consume you.
I was just trying to, yeah. I was just trying
And
to look.
yet, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And yet, many of the great mystics have had great suffering. There's something about spiritual depth and suffering that go hand in hand. It's like if you go through it to the other side, not meaning you escape it, but you like go through it. I think of Ram Dass and he had his stroke, and
Mm,
after his stroke, he said, I don't wish you the stroke, but I wish you the grace after the stroke. And
mhm,
he never fully recovered from that stroke. So it's not like he got better and was like, oh, yeah, I can see
mhm.
clearly now. No, he was still suffering. There was still issues, physical issues. But he said the grace after, if you go through it, is so beautiful.
Yeah.
There's something there. What were you going to say?
I was going to say there's this quote by one of the early church writers. I can't remember it now. Honestly, I tried to look it up and I must have not done a good search or something, but it's a little bit of an odd phrase, but and it could be related to anything. But the Eucharist, there was this phrase. I think it might have been Augustine. I'm almost positive Augustine or Clement, Saint Augustine or Saint Clement, that said, in terms of the Eucharist, we are what we eat. And so, therefore, it's not just a little piece of crummy bread and a little sip or a little dip of wine. It really transforms us to be the real body of Christ in the world. It's food that feeds us, both individually and also collectively together to continue the teachings of Jesus. And so we are what we eat. I mean, your doctor would tell you that. I mean, you are what you eat, right? And the church says the same thing with the Eucharist. And so it's supposed to transform us. Um,
We can even go deeper. I know that we haven't even introduced our topic yet, but this is really interesting to me. The older I get, as you know, Dylan, and I circle this drain, I'll probably circle it forever, but I think everybody is food issues of just like, you don't want to do too much, you don't want to do too little, you want to do
yeah.
stuff. And I think that in our culture, we have such a food illness. I'm not even talking eating disorders right now. I'm talking just a food illness. And I believe firmly that even the energy of the food, when we eat chicken and that chicken, when it was living, suffered its entire life, was bred in captivity, was um, around just like stacked on other chickens, that that energy of that life that we then consume, it goes into our body and makes us sick because
Mm-hmm.
energy
Yeah.
doesn't go away, right? Like what that animal went through, we are now consuming. Just like the Eucharist, we are consuming Jesus and
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is becoming part of us. It's all so enmeshed in a spiritual, mysterious way that we better communally, globally, even almost now, figure out what the hell we're doing when it comes to food. Because then you have people who are trying to correct it, but then they become so rigid with their food that that's not the answer either.
Right.
Because I've seen kids that come out of rigid food homes and it's not usually good, right? So I
Right.
don't know what the answer is. I don't think there is an answer except communally. We got to start looking at creation for what it is, which is in a constant exchange, not even exchange, but a constant enmeshing of energies, because the food that we eat matters. How we treat our cows matter. How we treat the radish root that comes out of the ground matters, if we're abusing the earth and then we eat that radish, we're consuming all of that. The whole story, we're consuming it and it's in us somehow. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. So I don't want to get
I know
off
this
of
is going to be a food episode, but this is
yeah,
so
I don't want to get off of our thing, but I remember my dad when he would take, Seth, who's my younger brother, and I fishing. He would always talk about, the plastic, or the iced tea container, the cigarette packet that was just like laying and floating in the water, and that's not good, and we shouldn't litter, and that affects the fish and it affects the water, and I remember my dad talking about that a lot, and realizing that this whole creation, uh, when we go to fish it, and then we fish, and then we release it back into the water, there's something there, and some people are even against that, and I get that, I understand that, but cleaning up, that what you are, or people that actually fish, and then they eat the fish, they live off of that because that is their lifestyle and their culture. um, what is going into the earth, or what is going into the chicken that you eat, or the beef that you eat, or the pork, or whatever the case may be, matters. And
yeah,
even if it's not happening in the wild, and it's being grown in kind of a commercial farm or something like that, all of the things that are so beyond sometimes even our knowledge, that are being pumped into these animals in particular, and not only animals, also plants. A large percentage of our vegetables are now grown in greenhouses. That's not necessarily a big thing, a bad thing, but they are sprayed and they are chemically
yeah.
grown. So
This is actually all related to our episode, and I'm thinking right
mm,
now about even 2000 years ago,
mhm,
Jesus was talking to people who were obsessed about what they consumed. Right now, at the center of our culture, everybody I talk to is questioning this. What do I consume and what do I not consume? And
yeah,
not just food, but also content. You don't want to be unaware of what's happening on the global stage. Also, a heavy diet of what's happening on the global stage will make you sick. So,
mm,
what do we consume? When do we consume it? How do we consume it? How much do we consume? It's just a question right now with food
mhm,
and content. But 2000 years ago, if you remember, Jesus was talking to people saying, because they were obsessed with food laws, what do we eat? What's unclean and what's not unclean? And
right,
he said, it's not about what goes in you because that's just going to end up in the privy.
mhm,
It's about what comes out of you, right?
yeah,
So, I mean, these are questions that they were wrestling with 2000 years ago. What food is clean? What is not clean? What do I eat? What do I not? And he essentially said, mm. Now he also wasn't dealing with microplastics inside turtles and like right.
yeah.
But so I'm not saying
But they
those aren't
were,
important, but there was
but
a lot there. There was, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yes, but what they were dealing with, so they were dealing with different types of pollution things. I mean, I never knew this growing up in church, because what quote unquote, why would that be talked about? But when I went to seminary, and I took environmental classes about how to be an environmentally friendly and justice centered Christian, uh, there was horrible pollution in Jesus's day, and even before in other cultures. I mean, people who study history know this. I mean, the garbage piles that would be piled up outside of cities, and stench, and bring rodents. Um, there was terrible things, raw sewage going into water systems, where there were no aquifers, and no, so Jesus was fully aware of the need to care for creation,
Mhm.
and so it was there. It was just, it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't a microplastic, but it was, somebody's old wagon wheel, or
Mhm.
chariot wheel that was thrown, and now that stuff's leaking into the water, and it's being burned, so it was all there.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Well, this is episode 64. And we are talking about we're talking about the word empire. And my computer's lagging. Okay, we're talking about the word empire. And the reason we're doing this episode is because I think a lot of people think they know what empire means, and you probably do. But just out in the wild in my life, I have this friend that I hang out with often, and she said to me, she said, I love how you use the word empire. Um, and she's like, that's just not a word that a lot of people use. And I love it. And it made me realize, like, oh, not every so in our circles we actually hear that word all the time, you and I, right? I do you?
Yeah.
But I think that maybe there are some people, depending on what stuff you're interested in and what you see online and who you talk to, that's not a word that you use all the time. Dillon and I probably drop it a dozen times a day to each other. But so empire. So we're going to talk about that word empire and what it actually means. And then we've talked about this on some episodes, but I want to focus it in today. So first I'll talk about the word, and then we're just gonna, I have some notes. You have some notes?
I do.
Here we go. Empire. So empire comes to us from the Latin word imperium. And imperium means command, authority, or the power to give orders. And this is important because I think sometimes when people think about empire, they think of land, they think of geography. Like the Roman Empire, they conquered lands and they got physically bigger. And that sometimes can be part of it. But at its core, empire is about who has the authority to give commands, who has the authority here, who has the power. We could do a whole episode on power too. Actually, I'm going to write that down, power, because that's a word that needs some unpacking. But it's about authority, right? So when we think about empire, we can think about land, armies, borders, and flags. But before there's any of those things, there's authority. And somebody has to fight, usually violently, to achieve that authority. And I would argue that real authority, you don't have to fight for it. You just live authentically. We all know a few people in our lives where it's like, oh, that's a person I would follow because they're not trying to be in charge of you. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to talk about the difference between an empire and a kingdom. But is there anything else you want to add just to the?
I just think that it's important for some people. I just have very brief notes here. Just that I don't want to list them all together, but that within the Bible, between the Hebrew Scriptures, or sometimes obviously known as the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are 9 to 10. People lump two of them, so there could be 9 or 10, depends on how you want to categorize them. But empires throughout the Bible,
Yeah.
That people have dealt with, names that we would know, people like Noah and Jesus and and Moses and Aaron and even Miriam. Some of the, we don't talk about the women leaders enough, but so and it's very important because sometimes these empires, or at least their leaders, directly or indirectly, are linked to certain texts and certain stories in the Bible, and because we have sometimes a lack of understanding of ancient history, when we hear these names, they just kind of brush over us, or we're like, oh God, what does that mean? But they're all there.
Yeah.
And so,
The backdrop of the Bible is empire. And what's so beautiful about the Bible, and when people, the older I get, the less I even try to argue about the factuality of the Bible because I just don't care. But when people do start to push it, the first thing when they start to ask me, like, how can you believe that stuff? I say, well, number one, I don't believe all of it to be factually, literally true. And that's the constant wrestling, and that's what makes it fun. But number two, for me, one of the most beautiful things about the Bible is very rarely do we get preserved texts that were written by the losers of the war, that were written by the people who were oppressed. And in the Bible, that's what we have.
Yeah.
And we have to start there. I can't even imagine reading the Bible without like putting on that lens, those glasses first. Like, it is written by the people who are being hurt and harmed and oppressed and enslaved by empire.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember where some of especially the Hebrew text, the Old Testament, it's important to when you are reading those stories or telling those stories to an individual or your children, or you're hearing it at church or something like that, it is important to remember that some of these huge empires, such as the Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians, all these things that we might get one little course in maybe high school, and then it kind of glosses us over. Um, those huge empires, specifically the Babylonians, which kind of in the beginning of the Hebrew text is very we kind of are a little bit familiar with the Egyptians because we're told the Moses story, and we kind of connect the pharaohs of Egypt with Moses. But like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, that I don't want to like go on here and like bore, but like I mean, most people aren't reading the books of like Second Kings, right? Mm-hmm. You know, Second Kings. They might read Isaiah, they might read Jonah, but if you're not reading those books, you're never going to really know too much about the Assyrians. If you read Jeremiah or Ezekiel, we were just talking about Ezekiel. You have the Babylonians there. But most people just read Exodus and they know the Moses story, so they know the Egyptians. But there's so many more. There's so many.
Yeah. We know the Torah. We know like the first 5 books are like, okay, they were liberated, they're in the desert. Mm-hmm. But then we kind of stop whenever it's time for them to structure themselves in their new land. And then like even me, sometimes I'm guilty of this, where it's like, okay, that's so interesting. Now let's jump to whenever Jesus was born. But actually in the middle, we get a lot of stuff. One of the things that we get in between there is the growing desire for a just Messiah.
Yeah.
Which is a huge thing with empire. So if you listen to our Messiah episode like a year ago now, I don't know, a long time ago, Christ means Messiah. Messiah means anointed one, which is the king. People were waiting for a just king like David, because under King David, David and Goliath, that story, right? And David is king. And he is, first of all, he does some terrible things. So we got to call that out too. He was not, like, by our social standards today, not great. But people did tend to prosper. That's how the story goes. People tended to prosper under his rule, and then he was gone, and then there were a string of other people. It didn't go great. Solomon built things with slave labor, even though they were formerly enslaved. It just became like humans just make the same mistakes again and again, it seems. So they really wanted a Messiah from the line of David. That's the whole story we've been handed. And because a kingdom is different than an empire. Now, we have to really break this down in its context, because today, kingdoms, we have colonialism and all of that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about kingdoms biblically. So let's talk about the difference. Are you ready, Dillon? The difference between...
I love that. I love this. I wish this was talked about more. Yeah.
So jump in anytime you have to give some context. So empire is an authority imposed from the top down. It's imposed by military force, law. Economic extraction is a big one, right? Like if another nation has oil that another nation wants, that's imperial. So whenever people say empire, remember it comes from the Latin imperium. And imperialism, imperial powers, empire, those are all linguistically linked. Those are all the same things. That's an imperial act, right? So economic extraction, you have a resource, I want it, I'm going to come in with my violence, with my war horses, with my Navy fleet, whatever it may be. And cultural dominance is another one too. So if we see another, I have a lot of Muslim students in my classes, and they do research, especially the women. Every semester, they do a lot of really good research for me on their hijabs that they wear, and how white people often will think that that's suppression from our lens. And they make really good arguments using research about how white people need to stop coming into their countries telling women that that's a problem, because listen, there's a line, that's a very messy topic, but I am saying that we don't get to impose our cultural dominance on them and say that's wrong, because there's actually an argument to be made for many countries that it's not, right? It's very complicated. So we need to stop doing that. So cultural dominance, thinking that our way is the right way, that's imperial, that's empire, that's an imperial act. So those, and this is important for empire, those at the top benefit, and those at the bottom and on the margins supply these benefits to the top. Think Hunger Games with the capital, right? That's like extreme empire. You have a group that benefits, but people who are pushed to the side of society or at the bottom are supplying those benefits for the top. That's a predictor that it's an empire. A kingdom, especially biblically, now we can't just say a kingdom biblically all the time, this is what it is, because a kingdom can take many shapes just like empire can, but it's not always geographic. The kingdom, whenever Jesus talks about a kingdom, it is a way of life. It is a set of values. It is a group of people, right? A kingdom. It's an allegiance rather than a citizenship, right? Biblically. Do you think I'm explaining that well enough? There's a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So there's a lot in the Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament, about the importance of kingdom. Sometimes I bristle at this terminology, but a divine kingdom or a godly kingdom, and what that might look like. One of my favorite images, real quick, this is moving to the New Testament, but is that there is a chair or a throne, and the person who sits on it is the Good Shepherd, is Jesus. It's not a throne with decked out, but it's this kind of little stool or chair, that this gentle shepherd, this Good Shepherd, this king sits on and helps people navigate through the pastures. That's one of the best, for me, kind of ideas of what a kingdom it looks like. And I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to say, like, if you look at what Jesus was trying to do, to bring God's kingdom here on earth, it was about it was about having a kind of a central person with other people to help him, working together, and to liberate people to live within a kind of new way in the world. And that's the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, as it's sometimes known, on earth. That is so different than empire.
Yeah. Yeah. Kingdom in the Gospels is a concept, not a place with borders.
Right.
That's not to say that in the Hebrew Bible, which you were kind of talking about, that there was an actual kingdom. In fact, when they first this is a problematic phrase now, but when they first got to the promised land, right, which is biblically what it's called, but when they first got to this land, there was actually a lot of discourse in these communities. No king. You can't have a king. Don't have a king. We're not doing a king. But of course, because they didn't know another way, there was a king.
Well, and you had, not to bore people here, but they specifically did not want a king. So for many years they had the ruler. Some would argue elected, appointed, however you want to kind of look at it. They had judges. So someone would go and to administer justice, like that of a king, but not with the kingly title, and not with the kind of full benefits of what a king of that time would have had. So there was the time of the judges. Then there was fighting between both the northern and the southern kingdoms. Nobody's hearing that mostly in a sermon on a Sunday, or even too much in Sunday school these days.
Well, that's even how we get Israel.
Right, correct.
Judea, yeah. Because there's a split.
Yep, the northern and southern kingdoms. And
culturally, I find myself in this tension because in a lot of the books that I write, I have to say this so carefully because I would never want to do harm, but culturally talking about the Jewish faith is so tricky because they have been so hurt that you don't want. It's just tricky because they've been hurt and you want to respect them, and their faith is so beautiful, and Christianity is built on that faith, and our Messiah was Jewish, right? So how do you lift up the beautiful parts of that faith? But also, even in the Bible, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people have done violence.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about it very much, but the promised land was not, it even talks about it in the Bible, that there was not, it was not an empty land for the taking. They had to commit genocide right in the beginning of their story in their new land, right? So that's really tricky to navigate. And I know my publisher, even we went through in my book, we didn't say promised land at all because of what's happening in the Middle East right now. That's a very difficult political phrase that's weighted. It's just all very tricky. But we have to
Yeah.
acknowledge that in the Bible, there was violence, there was genocide, there was a lot, sometimes done to the Hebrew people. Oftentimes they were oppressed, but they also returned that violence sometimes to get what they
Mm-hmm.
want, and they called it God ordained, and that's tricky.
Yeah. Well, and even so it's a little bit of the reversal, but like it's important to remember that the northern kingdom of Israel, or Israel, which is the appropriate way to say it, even though most people don't. But that they were, so that was a kingdom, right? But that kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire.
Right.
And so now, not the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom, and so therefore they were trying to set up a kingdom, and in swoops this huge Assyrian Empire. If you know anything about the Assyrian Empire, um, they were not very kind, but and so you have that, and that's where you have some of these cries for justice from people like Jonah and Isaiah and again Second Kings. If you read Second Kings, you get a lot of that.
Well, and those cries for justice are kind of pulled into the Gospels too, because then you have John the Baptist
Yeah.
and you have Jesus of Nazareth. They are crying out. In fact, a prophet is simply somebody on the margins of a society, because that's where you can see collapse first, crying out, saying, "This isn't okay." You see it now. Didn't we do a whole episode on prophet? I think we did.
I think we did.
But
Can't
you see
remember.
it now in our own culture. It's people who are pushed to the margins, people of color, women, just these people who are on the margins who aren't getting resources. They can see into the center more clearly than people in the center. And they're crying out saying, "This isn't working. This isn't going to last." And there's something about the divine setup of reality where it collapses if people are forgotten. It
Hmm.
collapses. It can't sustain itself for too many generations. And that's, I mean, it's 2026 now, and I'm thinking about how it's the big 250 for the United States of America. And Dillon and I have a lot of conversations about what it means to be patriotic, because we feel like a certain genre of American has like hijacked that word. But
Hmm.
actually, you can be patriotic and critique. In fact, Richard Rohr says that which cannot be critiqued becomes evil very quickly.
Yeah.
So to be patriotic means to critique and to really look at it, but it also means to listen to those on the margins, because they have wisdom that we can't possibly see. I tend to identify more as somebody in the middle, more privileged than marginalized. The only thing that I have is womanhood, but I'm pretty lucky and privileged in this life, so I'm blind to a lot of it. So if I don't listen to people who are suffering, I can support the system unintentionally. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. No. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I can be empire. I'm
Hmm.
probably more empire than oppressed.
Hmm.
So I have to stay awake to it, which is what Jesus was saying.
Hmm. And
They,
it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting too with to reflect on some of these small kingdoms that were set up in the kind of the course of the Israelite and Hebrew peoples. Um, some of the empires that came in, some of them destroyed everything right off the bat. They destroyed their property. They destroyed people in terms of and killing them mostly. And so they just kind of flattened it, and they wanted to start all over and take over, right? But then other empires, they kind of had a little bit more. So there was that, and that's bad, right? Taking people and destroying them and pillaging them and yada yada. Terrible, horrible, heinous. And then there were other empires that were a little bit more manipulative in that they would come in, they would conquer, they would let people keep kind of their cultural traditions to appease them, but you knew who was in control. And so
But they
therefore,
didn't. Can I say something about?
hold on,
Okay, go
hold
ahead.
on. So, and therefore, what would happen is it would look like you can still practice your culture, your religion, your whatever, but it was deeply, deeply corrupt in that the people who were leading your religion, leading your kingdom, were that deep seated in with the empire that money was going to them, lying was going on,
Well,
appeasement.
ground it though. You're touching on my wheelhouse, which is the Roman Empire. You're talking
Right,
about here.
right,
You're
right,
talking about the temple.
right.
The leader of the temple was appointed by the Romans. The Romans would
Mhm.
conquer people, let them keep their religion, but the Romans would say, because remember this, they believed in many gods, right?
Yeah.
They would
Hmm.
say, you can have your temple, you can have your whatever, to all kinds of groups, but
Hmm.
specifically the Israelites, you can have your temple, you can have your sacrifices. The deal is though, you have to pray to your gods for me once a day.
Hmm.
Like you have to do it regularly.
Hmm.
So they would conquer these people and say, yeah, sure, have your God, but make
Hmm.
sure I'm in good with your God. Make sure you pray for me, make sacrifices for me, all this stuff, right? So it's like, oh, it's freedom, but it's controlled. You're still in a cage. They just didn't know it, which is like the worst kind of freedom.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too because even in the thinking this, I actually wrote it in my notes here. That so we get that with Rome, like we just talked about with the Roman Empire and the Jewish people in particular, and others, but you also see this the Persians, the Persian Empire when they conquered Babylon. Um, they allowed the Jewish people to exile to return home, and then what they did is they supported the initial kind of groundbreaking of rebuilding the temple, but many historians say with strings attached. And you see this in like the Book of Esther and Nehemiah and Ezra. This idea that okay, so the Persians, the Persians kind of set the people and release them, allow them to be released under the kind of auspice of Babylon, and they supported the rebuilding of the temple. You know, but there was some ties there. You know, there was some connections there that yeah they supported them but they might have had to do some things that kind of appease the people that actually set them free. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
And do you have something else? No?
No, no, and
Okay.
I think it's also important. So
You're so funny because
sorry.
you say no when you mean yes, and you say yes when you mean no. And I don't know if that's a thing like in this area. I
I
don't know
don't
how you
know.
do it. So you do have
Well,
something to say.
I just have one little thing to say. So in the beginning, we talked about the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, all in the Hebrew text, right? And then kind of, so sometimes we'll talk about those, and then we'll almost jump directly into the New Testament where you find Rome and the Roman Empire. But in between there, specifically in the Maccabean age, so when you find what it kind of in the middle, it's about 500 to 600 some years of history. You are dealing with the Hellenistic Greek Empire. And you find this in the books of the Maccabees, in Tobit, and in others. There's about 9 of them or so. Some would count a couple more, but and they're dealing with they're dealing with it with even a change in understanding of who they are as the Jewish people, as they are kind of living in this Hellenistic Greek empire. And so if you kind of miss those that some people would call it the intertestamental period. I don't like that because it's basically saying that God wasn't speaking, which I think is inappropriate and not correct. But there's kind of this like a couple hundred years in between from like the old Hebrew text, and then before you cross over, sometimes scholars will call it the bridge period. It bridges the old Hebrew text to the new Christian text in the New Testament. But you must talk about the Greek empires.
Right.
People,
It is just empire to empire to
yeah,
empire of
and
these
and
people
and
being
the
oppressed.
and the Greeks, the Hellenistics, the Greeks, speaking about people like Alexander the Great, were very well known. That's why you start to see a move in this kind of bridge period of people, specifically Israelites, and then moving into the Jewish people coming out of the kingdoms. You see that a lot of them start to actually lose. They don't know Hebrew anymore. Their religious texts are in Hebrew, but they actually don't know Hebrew anymore. They can't speak Hebrew. They can't write Hebrew.
Well, the same thing happened in Christianity.
Yeah, they're
It was put into Latin for the general people, but then
right,
eventually Latin became the language of the elite.
right, right,
And now it's a dead language, right? That's how it tends to work.
right. And so you start to see more what we would call Hellenistic Jews. So Jews in terms of culture and even religion, but ones that are finding themselves living under an empire, a Greek empire, and this affected the Jewish life and their theology of understanding things and even their politics. And so if we miss that kind of bridge period, that's a lot of history and a lot of culture to miss if you with um if you kind of don't talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm doing exactly what you're saying we shouldn't do, but I want to jump to the Roman Empire because that is the Roman Empire is the empire in the room, if you will, like the elephant in the room. It's the empire in the room. It's the backdrop to all of the Gospels. You cannot understand the Gospels if you do not understand what is happening with the Roman Empire. And what's so compelling about that, I don't know if I have this book easy to access. No, I don't have it. There's this book by Scott. I can't remember his last name. Scott whatever, but it's called Hidden Transcripts, and it's all about how throughout history, and I know I've referenced this book before because it's like the book of the decade that I read during my doctorate program, and essentially many sacred texts operate this way. A lot of art operates this way, but essentially anytime somebody's being oppressed, which is often, there are texts that are hidden transcripts, meaning they are using language that those with power would never understand. And that's what we have in the Gospels. The Jesus story that we have been handed, rarely do they even say Romans or Empire or Roman Empire, or they don't even call out the emperor, right? That's very rare. And yet every single part of the Gospels, the Roman Empire's in it. It's right there if you know what you're reading, right? Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So the Roman Empire is rarely directly named because you have to think this was not a democracy, this was an empire. Critiquing an empire, you'd be beheaded. You don't do that, right? That was not seen as an intellectual superiority that you can critique an empire, right? No, that is not allowed. You don't do it. It was dangerous. And it's why Jesus was killed, right? People were calling him a king, the Messiah, the anointed one. They didn't want talks of kingdoms in the empire, right? He was killed because he critiqued the empire. So language had to be coded, symbolic, theological. if you've been listening to this since day one, you already know this. It's all we talk about here. It's all I talk about here. But some basic examples. Jesus is Lord is a political statement against the empire because Caesar was called Lord. So anytime the Bible says Jesus is Lord, right, and calls Jesus Lord, Roman Empire is right there behind the text, right there lingering. People of that day knew what that meant, calling Jesus Lord. Gospel, the fact that they called these texts gospels, so anti-empire, because gospel was an imperial word used for announcements of Caesar's victories, right? But now you're saying, oh, the story of Jesus is actually a victory story.
Yeah.
That's so anti-empire without even mentioning empire. So reclaiming this imperial language, that's what the Gospels are all about, which is so interesting to me. They're taking, again, remember, at the core of empire, at the core of imperial power is who has authority. Every time they call Jesus Lord, they call it a gospel. There's countless other examples. I mean, it's just everywhere. Every page of the Gospels have this anti-empire language.
Even
Every
the
time.
son.
The Son of God. Yeah. Yeah. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of times we'll talk about the Son of God, and we somehow literally connect that to Jesus being the Son of God the Father in particular, God the Creator. And sure, metaphorically, yes, but that's much more of a that's much more of a political statement that has become something else, which isn't necessarily bad, but that is a direct slap in the face
The Emperor.
to the emperor. Even in baptism, when we use that formula, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we are saying you are baptized into the Son of God, who is Jesus, is not the empire, is
Yeah.
not the emperor. It's a very, even in the baptismal liturgy, using the capital SON is
Well, and we did a whole episode on this, but to make it really short, Julius Caesar died. He was respected. People said, oh, he is a god. After he died, the Roman Senate very bureaucratically decided, hey, this was before the Roman Empire even existed. This was the Republic. They said he's a god. And then Augustus decides, hey, Augustus is Julius's adopted son, nephew, adopted son, whatever that was common in the ancient world. So his son becomes the ruler, and he decides to capitalize on that and say, hey, if my father's a son, then I'm the son of God. So, and because he didn't want to wait, all of these people were made divine after they died. And Augustus said, I don't want to wait. I'm the son of God. So I have divine blood while I'm alive. And this hunger for God to be made flesh is so human. It's been there all along, right? So people called him the Son of God. And then every emperor after him in the Roman Empire came, right? And every emperor after him was called the Son of God. And then you have Jesus, people saying, which again, I don't care if you literally, it's not that I don't care, it's something to wrestle with. But for me, like, was Jesus actually God? What does that mean? That becomes less interesting once you know the cultural story. They're like, no, what you actually have in the Jesus story, if you believe that the direction of humanity and creation is divinely unfolding, which I believe, and you see the Jesus story as like a line in the sand of humanity of something new coming. Jesus flipped the definition of power in humanity. And now you have these, and the Jewish people, like the whole story unfolding is flipping, like, hey, those emperors, the Son of God, with their violence and their war. Well, I mean, throughout scripture, Jesus, how do I want to word this? They wanted Jesus to be a king with an army. He wasn't. He didn't have war horses. He had a donkey. They wanted him to take up arms. He didn't. They wanted him to take up a sword. He didn't. He took up the cross. They wanted him to slaughter their enemies. He didn't. Instead, he was slaughtered by the enemy. And people still, because there's something deep in our divine blood in us, right? This, like, I mean, people would say it's on your heart, right? Like the law is written on your heart. There are some things that our body just knows. And so many people around the globe knew that there's something about this Jesus story that is more true than the violent warhorse emperors of the world. Right? Do you want to push back on that at all?
No, I don't want to push back. I want to solidify that. Hope to solidify that. The Hebrew people, a select group of them, a majority of them, it depends on how you're looking at it, who were long awaiting a Messiah, an anointed one, in what the New Testament we would call a Christ, right? What they were awaiting was not God. It was a messenger of God. The Messiah is not God. The Messiah is an anointed one by God, a Messiah, one giving the message of God, a prophet, one giving the message of God. And Christ in the New Testament is, in a Greek way, understanding that God in Jesus is bringing that message, that prophetic message of something new that God has to share with us. That the Hebrew people were looking for a Messiah, one to come and tell us what God wanted to do, a prophet, a Messiah, a Christ, not God. Okay? That was that.
Can I add one quick thing? Is that you have to remember, I have to remind myself of this all the time. We think of like there's secular life and then there's like divine life over here. In their consciousness during this time, there was no separation. They were so intimately connected. Like even non-Jewish people, just gods were just there, part of their life. Everything was ordained by a god. That's why there was a god of wine and fertility and a god of the earth and a god of this. Everything had an assigned deity because God was amongst them. It was just part of their life. There was no disconnect. I think that's really important to read the story through and to hear it through.
It is. But yes, it is. And what we find in Jesus, at least what the Christian historic claim is, that Jesus of Nazareth meets what the Christian understanding is of what the Hebrew people were saying: a Messiah, a prophet, a person to share with us the message of God's kingdom on earth. And in all of those things, we see that in Jesus as the Messiah, right? The one who came to give us the message, right? That's on the Jewish side. And this is not a binary, this is a parallel together. On the Roman side, or the Gentile side, or the Greco-Roman side, you have a very different culture going on. You have people who are demigods, who are half God, half human. That was not so much going on for most of Jewish history. There was one God. In the beginning, there was some polytheism going on, and then that kind of got tramped out. But it was this monotheism of one God. They knew that there were other gods, but they only worshipped one God, right? On the Greek and the Roman side, under the Roman Empire, something totally, totally different. And so the early Jesus followers realized that if Jesus was this Messiah, this Christ, this anointed one, this prophet of God to share this new kingdom of God on earth, then he also in a parallel way had to exhibit, or had to have within him, the same titles and the same power and authority that these corrupt Roman emperors were saying. And so, like things like Lord and Savior and Redeemer and Liberator and Conqueror, Son of God, that solidified that Jesus is not just the Messiah, but is truly the fullness of God within himself, who is sharing that with the world. So that's how you have that Jesus becomes equal with that of God, because it's God coming to us. There's a lot going on there, but this idea that we're taking this beauty of the historic message of the messianicness of Jesus from the Hebrew scriptures, and also taking this kind of corrupt nonsense that was going on in the Greco-Roman period,
And kind of reclaiming it.
And reclaiming that, you now have these two heavy authoritative balances in Jesus of Nazareth. The early Gentile people saw Jesus as something much more than just a prophet or a Messiah. And so bringing those two together is kind of where Christian theology, in terms of Christology, the study of Christ, of Jesus, would come out of. I know that's a lot, but it's so important to empire. It's so important to empire.
I also love these conversations because over and over again, I realize that a life of faith is both like philosophical and not rational. I often find when you start talking about Christology and like begotten, not made, and all and like that kind of stuff, I find I can actually feel it physically. I find my awareness dropping from my head to like here.
Yeah.
Like I feel, I know this is woo-woo, and we need to stop apologizing for woo-woo because it just is at this point. But like, I feel myself, I stop thinking about it and I feel pulled into it instead. Do you know what I mean? But then there's also this like grounded cultural political reality of the Jesus story that is heady and is it's both at the same time, and I love it.
Well, and the beauty of even the wording in the creed is so anti-imperial. We can talk about the creeds all we want, and there's
one God.
And also the phrase that you just said, which is in the Nicene Creed,
begotten,
not made. The next line is of one being with the Father. That is directed at the early Roman understanding that the Son of God, this isn't just somebody who was created. It was somebody who actually came from God, God's self, the Father, or the Creator, and is at one with the Father. Is
the only one, because every emperor was the son of God. So this was saying he's the only one.
He's the only
period.
one. He's the only one. Period. There's a new way of being in the world. And the creed tried to solidify that, not probably in the best way in the beginning, but now if we can understand what they were trying to stamp out in terms of the corruption of the Roman Empire, this begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. So it's saying through this understanding of Christ and Jesus, all things come, all new things come, all things have been made, because the emperor claimed all things. All things came from the empire. All things came from the emperor. Not the people who were, laboring in the fields.
And not God for providing the fields.
So this idea that all things come from Christ and Christ brings all people unto Christ's self. It's deeply beautiful.
It's also so the question that we start every episode with is, what have you been paying attention to? And something that's been kind of grabbing I don't even like paying attention, but what's had your attention? Something that's been grabbing my attention, and I've been talking to you about it a little bit at a time, but especially in parenting, is like, I'm constantly asking myself, I think most of us are asking ourselves this question all day long. What's the right thing to do here? What's the one right way? What's the one true way? And I'm realizing more and more, it's starting with parenting, but now it's bleeding outward into everything for me. Oftentimes there isn't, like, this idea of a utopia is not real. This idea that there's one right ethical, moral path or way, there's one right decision. What is it? Actually, I'm finding that the thing to do is just to be in the mess. And if we believe Jesus was divine, and that's what Jesus did, was just in it, in the thick of it, went right into Jerusalem on a donkey, went right, like, was with the people, was with the suffering, touched the lepers, like, in it. Can you be in it? Can you be a parent who's actually present and in it? Because that's often all a child needs, is for you to be there. Even if you do the wrong thing, but can you actually be there with them? Same is true in a marriage. Same is true as a professor. I'm like, what's the best way I can teach this? And sometimes I kind of mess it up and they're confused, but can I be there in their confusion with them? And same with religion. I'm finding this is like where it really pans out for me. I think that some Christians are harmful. right?
Oh
And
yeah,
I think it's okay to think
definitely.
that, but then it can't push me into this, like, I want to be the perfect, because some of my things are harmful. Some of my way of doing things are wrong, or believing things are wrong. And it's not actually about, I mean, if God wants us to be right or wrong, God help us all, right? Which is kind of the point. It's like, and it's not even about like, be 1% better than yesterday. Get out of here with that. Can you just be in it? Can you be here? That's more and more. That's all I believe we're here to do is, can you be here? Can you be present with it all somehow? Okay, my monologue is over. I have a little bit more to say about Empire. Anything else for you? Oh,
Just that there are other, just so people know, some know already, but for those that don't like to get into the nitty gritty history of the biblical text, there are other that we did not mention on this podcast. There are other empires, such as like the Hittites and other types of empires, the Parthian Empire, and all these other, I don't want to say smaller ones, but less mentioned, that are there, and it's important to be mindful of them, and what they brought and what they also took away, and how they oppressed and how they liberated. And so I would just say that, and my last comment would be, there's an old question of whether Jesus himself saw himself as fully God. And that's not a bad question. But I think that if that's the only question that you're asking, you're probably going to come to a dead end.
that's exactly what I was going to say. I said, that's a
Yeah,
question with a dead end.
you're going to come to a dead end. Whether or not Jesus of Nazareth saw himself as fully exhibiting God, in the way that we understand kind of Trinitarian theology today, I don't know. That's a stupid question for me. It's not a bad question, but it's just kind of a dead end, and it's kind of stupid. What I'm much more
It's not bad. It's just stupid.
what I'm actually, and most pastors, theologians, biblical, well, maybe not so much biblical scholars, but theologians, um, are interested in is, what was the experience of the people that they wrote down of how they experienced this Jesus of Nazareth? And that is fairly clear. One of my favorite authors is Marcus Borg, and he was a very, very inclusive, liberal Protestant theologian, in both the Lutheran and Episcopal traditions. And he would always say, when you're asking exactly what Jesus might have thought, that again isn't a bad question, but what did his followers exhibit, and what did they experience the kind of Jesus to be and the risen Christ to be? And two things right off the bat is that Jesus was Lord and Savior, and he was the Son of God. Those three things. There's much more, but that's what they saw in him. They were living in a kind of Gentile Greco-Roman world where they saw the the nastiness and the corruption. And they saw these things as Jesus exhibiting something new and matching that up with the Messiah. So the Jewish
They
Messiah.
almost preserved the ache that is in all of us, where when
Yeah.
we see corrupt power, we think there's got to be another way.
Yeah.
Jesus walked that way and demonstrated that way.
Right.
People noticed it and said, that's where power is.
Yeah.
The actions of Jesus spoke to the ache of humanity that still
Yeah.
exists today. I
Yeah.
think that's why the Christian story lasts. I think that's why a lot of religious stories last so long, is because
Yeah.
they all speak to the same thing, which is there's an authority and it's not that, right?
Right. And you see this in particular. This really is my last thing. You see this in particular, which is totally. This is where the empire starts to get really scared. Is that even after a man's death, after a murder and a state-sponsored execution, the presence of this Christ that has resurrected from the dead, this experience of people's visions and seeing and witnessing a continued, renewed resurrected understanding of that this Jesus of Nazareth, although bodily dead, has been raised and is new. That story continued to go on, and that Jesus is the Savior, and Jesus is Lord and Son of God and Liberator. Oh, the empire couldn't stand that. They thought they killed this guy. They thought that he was done, and these people said, oh no, this is a story that lives on. This is a story that resurrects. This is a story that
Not even just a story, but this is a presence that's going
yeah,
to
yeah,
continue.
this is an true presence, capital T. This is a true presence that people experienced and still continue to experience today, the true presence of Christ's resurrection from the dead. And that's a powerful experience. That is a very anti-empire and makes people in authority, when they want to just oppress, and it makes people a little shaky.
Yeah. So we kind of grounded it. I just want to pan out and give some general things about empire. So empires do a couple things. This is like real general stuff, which I hate being super general, but I'm going to be. They define what is normal. Empires get to decide what's normal. It's not okay. They define what is civilized, right? So if you ever find yourself someone being like, oh, gross, we're at a restaurant and they have their elbows on the table, chances are you're empire. You're an empire if you see somebody and you're like, oh, so well, no manners, so uncivilized. Well, empire gets to decide what is civilized. You know what I mean? Um, that's stretchy. That could be like heavily debated, right? There's cultural norms. Maybe there can't not be, but we always have to be questioning, where am I in this hierarchy of power in the systems that are right now? They get to define what is true, right? They tell you what is true. They send it down to their masses. All of that, by the way, right now in the Western world, in my country, in the United States, that's all crumbling. Our ideas of authority are crumbling. Our ideas of what is true are crumbling, right? We don't even know anymore. I go onto social media, I see a video, I don't even know because of AI if that's true. I really look at the mouth and I'm like, oh, I think that's AI. They have this famous person saying this thing, but they actually, and then I look it up and nope, that's not real, right? We don't even know what's real anymore. It's crazy. It's insanity out there, right? The idea of truth and civilization and what is normal is collapsing, but empire often tries to define it for us. And what's really important is that the imperial way, because imperial power can be so strong in the worst way, is the water that we're swimming in. So we often have to work to see it because we've normalized it so much. We have to see it for how strange and dangerous it actually is, right? But the way of the empire is not the only way. So I think we all know people who say very disempowered things like, well, that's just the way it's always been, just the way it is, right? I heard somebody a couple of years ago say something like, well, men have always been predators. That's just the way it's always been. It's the way it's always going to be. So disempowered. I have heard people say, well, there have always been people who have resources and people who don't. That's just the way it's always been. It's just the way of things. It's just the nature of things. Get out of here. That is so disempowered. And prophets are the people who have the imagination to say, no, there's another way. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that way could look like. Right? That's what Jesus did. That's what the kingdom of God was, is the imagination to have a society where everybody is cared for. Everybody counts. I'm not talking about communism and everybody gets the same thing, but I am saying a system where there is no, this person reigns on high and gets everything at the expense of everyone else, right? Go ahead. Do you have something to say?
Yeah. I think too. The power, or at least it can be powerful, depending on how you're relaying it to a person or a group, is the word salvation. I always go back to thinking that we talk about Jesus bringing God's salvation to the world, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and this idea of salvation, saving one and bringing one into an abundance of life, both in the here and in the hereafter, perhaps, but in the here and now. I think about the story of Zacchaeus, and Jesus coming to Zacchaeus's house, which is a Sunday school story, actually. And Jesus says, Today salvation has come to this house. Jesus has not yet died. He's not yet risen. And Zacchaeus is alive and well, and he's in the house, and he says, Today salvation has come to this house, abundance has come to this house. What might that look like? When we start to tell empire, no, no, today is the day of salvation, which sets us up for the continuation. If we can't believe that salvation or an abundant life is now, which Jesus said, that's when it starts. Uh, we're just going to keep falling into empire every time. We're just going to keep saying, "Well, that's the way it always is," or that's what you know.
It's true of everything. I like to take the grand and make it really specific because it helps me. It like I always go back to like addiction, right? If you are an addict, you can't keep saying I'll get sober tomorrow.
Right.
No, do it right now, right?
Right.
If you have a problem of some sort, or if you want to, this is a terrible thing, but like if you want to lose 10 pounds, you can't keep saying I'm going to start on Monday.
Right.
But right now is your life. And the same is true of salvation. Rob Bell used to always say this, you cannot recognize heaven later if you can't recognize it now. So practice now. What makes you think you're going to call it paradise later if you can't see fragments of paradise now and acknowledge it?
Right.
Because newsflash, eternal life has already started.
Right.
It's not something that has a start line later. It's now.
Yeah.
And I love that. Yeah. So one thing, a couple more things, because I love talking about empire. I think every episode is going to be a 20-minute episode, and it never is. But empire. So let's go back to like somebody thinking men have always been predators. It's just the way it is. They just have an appetite. It's just what it is for them, right? And there was this recent talk about prophets among us, right? There was this recent social media trend that I posted almost every time I saw it. I like shared it of these women who have like pit bulls and Rottweilers, like all these like aggressive quote unquote dogs, right? And they would put a dog treat right in front of them and the dog wouldn't eat it. I showed you some of these videos.
Yeah.
The dog wouldn't eat it. So it's this idea that like if we're saying that men, because empire is deeply wrapped up with patriarchy, right? If we're saying that like men could never control themselves around women, so let's just like it's just not going to happen. These are dogs that are better trained than men. Are you kidding me? They're more behaved than men. You're saying men, like there are so many people who think that, oh, this is just the way it is. Like they're just so disempowered. But we have dogs that can control themselves. And you think that you can't? You think that men with power, people with power can't control themselves and learn a new way? Dogs learned a new way. Are you kidding me? And I don't even mean to put dogs that far beneath humanity. I'm just saying that like, come on, like we can. Okay. So a couple more things. There are two spaces. I have to say this. There are two spaces that empire struggles to control. They always have. One is sexuality. They try so hard to control it and they can't, right? They can control who gets married on paper, but they can't actually control what happens behind closed doors. That's so deeply human and ingrained. Like it's our birthright so deeply. It's our birthright that they can't control it on a mass scale. And I think that's so beautiful. They can't control our sexuality. Number two, they can't control art. They've tried, but creating is so deeply human. I tell this to my students all the time. I'm not creative. Get out of here with that too. You were born. Everybody's creating all day, every day. Just because the world hasn't called it art doesn't mean it's not creation. Did you create an Excel spreadsheet for some kind of invoice that you had to do at work? That's a creative act. Did you create a business? Are you an entrepreneur? That's a creative act. Dillon creates sermons all the time. I'm a writer. Obviously, that like falls into art in the art world, but it doesn't have to be in the art world to be a creative act. We are all creating things all the time. Are you a parent? You created a person. That's a creative act. You are molding a person to the best of your ability in some small way, right? You're creating all the time. There's something about empire that they can't touch our creativity. They can't stop it. They can't stop it. Life, there's this Rumi line in a Rumi poem that goes, life is capital L life, referring to like God, right? But capital L life, life is hungry for itself. That's why it keeps making more of itself. It's why one seed is planted and it bursts into something with many seeds. It's why two people come together and they make multiple more people. It's why I sit down and I write 3 poems a day, because we can't stop making. An empire couldn't stop it if they wanted to. They've tried. They've burned books. They've destroyed art. They've killed artists. But then graffiti just shows up. Poems show up on the back of books hidden, right? Like, you can't stop it. Empire can't stop it. Those two worlds can't be controlled because they are our birthright. You can't take it from us. And I love that. So empire doesn't have the last word. And some questions that I am asking myself all of the time in every space and wrestling with. Again, there's no right answer here. It's just a thing to constantly be wrestling with. By the way, Israel means to wrestle with God. So Israel was a nation made out of a covenant, not a covenant made with a nation, right? So this nation, Israel, was made, I'm kind of ranting here, but a covenant is a relationship with obligations. And this nation was created out of this covenant, out of this relationship with God that had obligations on both sides. And there are questions. Okay, I'm getting excited. I'm going to talk for half an hour if I don't really contain myself. So these are the questions that I'm constantly living into, wrestling with, because Israel means to wrestle with God. Who gets to have authority in this space? And am I okay with that? Are we okay with that? Who has authority, right? Who absorbs the cost of this person having authority here? I think about this at committee meetings. Who is the chair and why? Is it because nobody else wanted it? Is it because they're actually the best for the job? Are they leading with integrity? Dillon is the pastor of my church, so I have a lot of bias here, but even like pastors at a church, any supervisor of mine at work, if I ever find myself in a leadership position, I'm not claiming to be a great leader. That leadership is not my skill, but I'm just constantly asking, is it just by default? Is there somebody else who wants it, right? Who has authority and why? Is somebody absorbing the cost of this person having authority? Are they talking down to somebody? And if so, it's my job to step in, because that's empire at play at a small scale. If you're at a committee meeting and somebody's speaking to somebody else unkindly and you let them just because they're the chair, no, right? You get to ask yourself, is somebody being harmed by this person being in the seat of empire, being in the seat of authority even, right? Whose voices are allowed here and whose aren't? If voices are being suppressed, it's also my job, anybody's job, to step up and say, they have something to say. Let them say it, and let us hear it and acknowledge it and incorporate it. So who gets to speak? Who's expected to stay silent? I used to work at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, which is a part of the U.S. Army War College. And I was at a meeting with many men from Kuwait. And I was told before I went into that meeting, I was the only woman in the room. And before I walked into that meeting, I was told, by the way, they will not shake your hand. We're going to line up. Everybody's going to shake hands. They won't shake yours because you're a woman, and you won't speak at this meeting. And that was very difficult for me. That was very, very difficult, right? So who gets to speak and who's expected to stay silent? And who in any space do we frame as deserving of resources? Right. So I'm thinking about church, because this is a church chatter podcast. If you're at a meeting and people want to give food out or something, and they're like, well, only this kind of person gets it, or only this kind of person gets it. Let's be very why only this kind of person, right? Like, let's really talk about who we're deciding is worthy of our resources and who isn't. I'm not saying that there can't be boundaries, because we can't give everything to everyone all the time, right? But those conversations matter. And this is an important one because I see it pop up all the time in spaces in my life. Who do we expect to be grateful for our scraps? Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I have been part of so many conversations where we're like, well, they should just be grateful that we're giving to them at all. It's like, but we're not really giving them that much. And we're expecting them to be so, so grateful. If we're just giving because we want to be thanked, let's check ourselves. So I think those are all, can you see how those questions are related to empire?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So empire is not just a system. It's a whole story we tell about who gets authority and who doesn't in any given space ever. It's not just this untouchable thing called empire, called politics that we have nothing to do with. It's actually at every part of our life. In our own family, Dillon and I are constantly, Dillon and I talk a lot. I'm a professor. My job is to profess. Dillon is a pastor. A huge part of his job is to preach. And we always joke about how we get paid to talk. Dillon gets paid more than me to listen. Maybe that's not entirely true. I have to do a lot of listening too, but we get paid to profess and to preach too. We're professional communicators. And in our home, we talk all the time to the point where we could really silence our children if we're not careful. So we, even in the context of our own family, have to be careful that it doesn't become imperial. And we are not the only two speaking. We have to make sure that they are given authority sometimes in their own lives and that they're given space to have a voice in our family. Every single space you're part of, family, committee meetings, big organizations, whether you're the leader or not, we should be thinking about who has authority and are they using it well? Okay, my rant's over. Anything else to add about empire?
Oh, that was great.
All right.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.